Welcome to Forbidden Planet TV. I'm Andrew Sumner, and I'm privileged to be joined by the mighty author, Jeff VanderMeer, today. How are you doing, Jeff?
I'm doing great. How about yourself?
Yeah, I'm really well, thanks, brother. I'm really well. And when you were last on the show, we were talking about your epic new novel, Hummingbird Salamander, which you can order from the links attached to this video. And we had so many questions. In fact, Forbidden Planet's head book buyer, Laura Dodd, who can't be with us right now, because our original interview was interrupted by a massive power cut in West
Area
London.
X probably was, somehow
yes,
involved.
Absolutely. Yeah, exactly. But Dodd had a bunch of questions that she wanted to get into. Now, one of the things you're really well known for is being at the vanguard, the forefront of new weird fiction. Mm-hmm. And which, and I don't want to talk out of turn here, but I've always kind of personally perceived as kind of a cross between horror and science fiction. How would you actually describe new weird fiction yourself, mate?
Well, I mean, it was this interesting moment in the early part of this century where a lot of writers, I think, were trying to combine certain different impulses. And I think you hit the nail on the head, even kind of like the Clive Barker body horror kind of thing is kind of like a precursor of new weird, mixed with the science fiction, mixed with like mainstream literary impulses that might have come out of like New Worlds or something in the 60s and 70s. And so I think of it as kind of like a recombining of different parts to try to create something new and something fresh. And I think there were a lot of authors interested in doing that at that time. And some of them may not be even writing stuff that's like that right now, but it definitely still influences their work. And you can see that. And probably the horror element is the anchor to some degree.
Yeah. Is it something that you're proud to have been involved with?
Well, I mean, it's kind of hilarious because in those initial discussions, I was kind of like, as I always am, because I'm very shy of labels, I was kind of like, I don't know if I'm buying into this. And then the irony, of course, was Mieville was selling so well that my ambergris stories were suddenly hot because they were new weird. So they got picked up. And then my position on it changed back and forth. Like in the Czech Republic, there were certain books that they could only get published because they were able to put them under the new weird label. So it became both a literary thing, a marketing term. It means different things to different people. At the end of the day, I think it's been more useful than not.
Yeah, I think that's true of labels across the board. I edit a lot of noir / hard-boiled fiction as part of my day job. And again, sometimes we'll be looking at manuscripts. It's like, is this actually noir? I don't know. But sometimes it's best just to sell things that way. Once you're dealing with kind of the brutal crime genre, for example, labels are very useful, I think, from a sales perspective.
Yeah, no, and sometimes, like I said, that kind of bleeds into the literary because, like in the Czech Republic, it was fascinating how the marketing label led to a literary movement, kind of, but in a good way.
So. Yeah, no, that really is interesting. Now, the characters in all of your novels really jump off the page. That's one of the things I get a real sense of with your work. And Dodd's question about this was, how do you accomplish that essential, almost like method acting that you have when you're writing your characters? What's that process like for you?
It differs from character to character. A lot has to do with the style of how they're writing, or if they're in third person, how I'm writing about them. I tend to do kind of a method acting where I try to imagine working through the day as if I'm that character. And trying to react like that character, and what will they notice that I wouldn't notice, and vice versa. And once I have that down, and once I have the style down, then I work on the interiority. So for like Hummingbird Salamander, you may have noticed the kind of noir sensibility of it, which is sometimes expressed through kind of clipped sentence fragments. But even there, it had to be like a hybrid style for this character. So I'll start a paragraph with a complete sentence, then a shorter sentence, then some fragments, and I'll end with another complete sentence. So sometimes it's just down to a craft thing that gets you to the interiority of the character and kind of like removes the first person I in a way that puts you right in the person's point of view. And it just depends. The biologist loves nature in Annihilation. So of course you get a lot of nature description. I have to make that do a lot of work, right? Because it can't just be inert description. It has to mean something else.
Of course. But it struck me, the thing about that is nature is something that very much resonates with you. I remember when we were last talking, you basically were talking about your upbringing and the imprint that left on you, and of course exploration of climate crisis is that call to arms is something that comes up a lot in your work.
Mhm.
So,
Oh yeah, absolutely.
So that being the case, I'm in terms of that exploration of climate crisis. I read that that your yard has become something of a wildlife sanctuary. Is that right?
Yeah, it is actually. We're lucky in Tallahassee where we have all these fairly deep but small ravines because it's actually pretty hilly in North Florida. And as a result, there are houses built all around the top in these suburban and urban neighborhoods, but there's a trough of woodland. And so we have this trough of woodland right behind us, in addition to the half acre of our actual, house. And when we first came here, it was full of invasive plants, which for people who don't know, if you don't have plants that are native to your area, they're basically a food wasteland for a lot of wildlife. So we took those out, put in a lot of native plants, and it's absolutely amazing how many we've seen over 120 species of bird in the yard, which is almost unheard of for an urban area. And things like that. We have box turtles down there, opossums, armadillos. And it's still only like 10 minutes from the city center. So one thing when you were talking about, the interiority of character and everything is now I have to kind of edit myself because I need to make sure I don't put descriptions in there of nature and other things with regard to the environment that are just because I really like that stuff. I have to make sure it's something the character would actually see or care about, so.
No, I get it. I mean, hearing you describe it, it sounds very much like you're almost developing your own Disney movie in your backyard.
Well, I mean, it is and it isn't. I mean, there's red-tailed hawks out there and owls and stuff, and I'm sure there's a lot of, well, not murder, but a lot of things going on at night between the owls and the rodents in the yard. So, but in general, it's been a very positive experience. And that is part of it. Everybody has to eat. So the yard provides that too.
Yeah, absolutely right. Absolutely right. And that is very true. I was almost going to tell a gruesome anecdote then, and I'm not going to but I might tell it off camera when we finish this conversation if we remember. So which is all about the wildlife I experience around where I live in London, as opposed to Tallahassee.
It's probably foxes and whatnot. Yeah.
Well, it is exactly a fox anecdote. Yeah, 100%. But I won't get into it because it's a bit on the gruesome side. So I wanted to ask you about the very thing we've eased into talking about, which is your use of place and location. So can you touch upon the importance of Florida itself in the Southern Reach trilogy, that elements of the ecosystems and whatnot?
Well, it's funny because as I was writing Authority, I was being asked these questions on Annihilation in the preamble to it or whatnot, even by my editor, about where all the fungus comes from, which of course also was in the Ambergris series. And I walked out the door to my car one day while I was writing Authority, and I realized there are just mushrooms everywhere. There's just like semi-tropical jungle all over the place near our house. And so, honestly, this is a really interesting area of Florida that just gets under your skin. The rate of decay, the rate of regrowth, the absolute biodiversity of it. And so I think that what you see in the Southern Reach trilogy with regard to nature and kind of like the overgrownness of it is just actually what it's like in North Florida, thankfully. We're one of the biodiversity hotspots in the entire world. And then also the fact that, that comes under threat from time to time. So like the Gulf oil spill was a big influence, I think, on Area X. I really think at the end of the day that my subconscious created Area X to try to kind of protect the area that I love, the St. Mark's Wildlife Refuge out there. The weird thing, talking about the lighthouse, for example, in Annihilation, is that I had never seen the inside of the St. Mark's Refuge lighthouse because it was all boarded up. And after Annihilation came out, they actually let me go and walk partway up it. And
wonderful! That must have been amazing.
I had never even seen historical photos, except for the size difference. So it's much larger inside in the book than it should be. It's exactly as it is in the book. So somehow I don't know how I conjured that up, but I know lighthouses can be somewhat similar, but still it was kind of amazing.
By some level of almost like universal osmosis. You actually just wrote about it super accurately.
Yeah, it was really strange. There's a lot of strange things about that whole experience.
I mean, that's interesting because that echoes some of the content of the book itself, and
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
and I find that fascinating actually. Annihilation, of course, was successfully adapted, and but obviously the big difference between the book and the film. Um, how did you feel about those differences personally?
Well, I think it's really, I really love Alex Garland's work in general, and it's just a case, and I could certainly gloss over. It's just simply a case of not being able to see the movie clearly because I did see the script at some point, and that was kind of weird seeing the difference between that and the book, and then being on the set and seeing like the set design which was partly incomplete because the CGI completes parts of it, and then seeing a rough cut of the movie before seeing the actual movie. It's just impossible to have that pure experience of going into a theater and just losing yourself in it. That said, the last third I think is more surreal than what's in Annihilation, and maybe more online with like what's in Acceptance in a sense in terms of how surreal it gets. So the main thing is that there's not a lot of environmental themes in there, but on the other hand, the irony of that is that the movie did well enough that it sold a lot of copies of Annihilation. A huge percentage of royalties from that goes right back into environmental causes. That allowed me to talk more about environmental causes. So at the end of the day, it was a positive learning experience. And it was funny too, because then he did Devs, and there's a lot of stuff that I think he learned doing Annihilation that's also in that Devs series, just in the way he was shooting certain things, especially in the early episodes. So it was kind of fascinating to see that afterwards. So
I think he's a very interesting choice for an adaptation of something that's so tied into climate issues, because
yeah.
I find him as a filmmaker. And by the way, I'm happy if anybody listening to me say this completely disagrees, including Alex Garland himself if he listens to it. But I find he has quite a creepy and antiseptic quality to his work, which which I've only ever really seen in one other filmmaker,
Yeah.
very different filmmaker, but a great filmmaker. It's Kubrick. Has
Yeah.
again this kind of creepy antiseptic vibe to it,
Yeah.
which is kind of at odds to the kind of the eco elements of your work. But I think it makes that Annihilation very interesting for that reason, I think.
Well, I mean, I think in that sense, it does make sense that he changed the themes to things that are more about depression and whatnot, and whatnot, because I really don't think he's that interested in ecological themes at all in general in any of his work. And the irony is, like, I'm working on these kind of new weird horror pieces right now, where I'm thinking this would be the perfect thing for Alex Garland to do a film on.
Right.
So it was actually such a relief then to be able to watch Devs and really enjoy the heck out of that without any kind of attachment or any prior images in my head or whatever.
Yeah, no, that's lovely. You also write nonfiction, of course, for the New York Times and the Guardian. Does your process change with the styles of output? Is it any different when you're writing nonfiction to when you're writing fiction pieces?
Generally, for nonfiction for me is more like, it sounds weird, but maybe it's like more like solving a mathematical equation, and doing a novel is more of a very immersive thing where when I'm in that mode, I'm kind of like receiving everything from the world, and it's somehow being transformed and put into the novel, or it's being interpreted that way. Nonfiction is a different kind of thing, although there's a passion to it lately, in part because so much of it is about the environment, and so much of it is about literally writing about the backyard and the lessons that learned from that. I mean, I have a piece probably coming out in a US publication called the 5 Summer Yard Hacks, and one of them is putting peanut butter by a yellow jacket nest, because then raccoons will find it sooner and eat it. Which is something that I discovered actually works. And it's actually much more effective and less harmful for the environment than using pesticide, because they always get the queen. Raccoons love yellow jackets. So if they find a nest, it just takes a while. And they have thick enough fur. And also yellow jackets, this is too much information, but
I love this.
They sleep they sleep at night. So when the raccoons at night come out and eat them, they're asleep. So it's just a fascinating thing that I found out. I was so happy to find out that there was an easy way of doing this so that the neighbor wouldn't be upset we had yellow jackets in our yard.
So can yellow jackets sting?
Yeah, they're one of those social wasps that stings. I've never had any problem with them because I move very carefully through the yard, and if something buzzes up against me, I don't swat it, I just move on, but yeah, they sting, so that was kind of fascinating. I've used squirrels to weed the yard, all kinds of things like that. So
this is absolutely
in the nonfiction,
this is brilliant to me, because I'm a huge in the nonfiction, of course. I'm a huge Marvel fan, always have been, and I'm a man of a certain age. So I read Ant-Man when I was a kid, and of course, one of the things that happens if you know your Marvel universe is at a certain point, Ant-Man loses his memory and he becomes another hero entirely called Yellow Jacket. And in the original Ant-Man movie, they use Yellow Jacket as the bad guy. Yeah, but in fact, what he is a whole period of time when the Henry Pym character doesn't know who he is and becomes this much more aggressive hero called Yellow Jacket. So to hear that explanation to me is fascinating.
Well, if they had really been doing their research, they would have had another character, which would be a huge bird character named Summer Tanager that would then eat Yellow Jacket, because Summer Tanagers love to eat Yellow Jackets in our yard. But that's probably a little too science-based.
You know what, mate? I love this because we're covering off your excellent novels. We're covering off Marvel Comics history, and we're covering off real, true life nature themes, which rarely enter this show
into the same conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's very interesting hearing you talking about your process for the nonfiction, because what I am actually by trade is a journalist, and one of the reasons I became a journalist is because I find journalism easy when I find it to be mainly about process, whereas I personally am far too lazy to indulge my kind of creative storytelling side. Whereas the great thing about journalism is nearly always you have something that you have to interpret that already exists. You don't have to come up with it from inside your head. And it is about ordering that and making it as interesting as possible, right? So they're two very different skills, I think.
I think they are. And I mean, I think that's also why I do book reviews. Every once in a while I'll do a piece that's passionate to me, but I don't have the skill set for the art of doing it, on a regular basis. It's something where usually it has to be something that I'm passionate about, or a book review, in order to kind of like jumpstart that process. But there's novelists that use constraint too. Jeffrey Ford freely admits that almost every short story he wrote has been commissioned for a theme anthology, and that requires what he requires sometimes to write something like that. So
he needs to be given the theme, and then
and then he does something that usually is just absolutely amazingly original, right? So
that is very interesting. And now on this note of about writing itself, one of the things that we at Forbidden Planet are proud purveyors of is the Wondrous Wonderbook. And so basically, how did that come about?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for carrying it and supporting it. It was ultimately such a joy, even though it was also such a pain to put together. And basically what happened was Abrams Image in the US came to me after something I did called the Steampunk Bible, which was actually kind of a journalistic enterprise for me, just exploring steampunk. And it did so well. They were like, well, what project would you like to do next? And I had always wanted to do a writing guide, but I wanted to do something that was different. I didn't want it to just create another writing guide that's like everything out there. So I said, okay, well, what about a fully illustrated, full color writing guide, 300 plus pages, and do it in trade paperback. So it's not like that isn't like a textbook, right? Because they could have done it as a textbook, it could have cost hundreds of dollars. And so they said, okay, fine. And then they gave me the money and said, why don't you just come back for creating it? And said, why don't you just come back with it camera ready and we'll do it that way. And so they did edit the text, but I've never had a publisher just say, here's some money, go create the book, camera ready for us to print. So then it was, then it was this amazing journey where halfway through the process, I wasn't even sure we had a book, because here I was trying to interpret these creative writing ideas into graphics, and some of them didn't work, right? So like a third of what we tried, we had to abandon. And I was working with a guy, Jeremy Zerfas, who's a genius, but self-taught. So originally he had the page number in a different place on every page because he thought that'd be funny. So anyway, so it finally came together, and I think it's really amazing. And the thing that's most amazing to me is that I wanted to create a book where you could go back to it over time and see it differently depending on what your experience level is. What I didn't anticipate is that because of the graphics, there were actually middle school teachers taking parts of it and using it with their kids for just creativity exercises, and then all the way up through grad school in the US in creative writing classes. So musicians, graphic artists, people finding things in it. So it's been this amazing experience where it's this joyful, playful book that just makes you feel good, I hope, but also has all this practical information, and it's definitely one of the best things I've ever done, I think.
Oh yeah, we love it, right? We love it, and I think for me, I think it's a truly successful piece of work, and just something you should be so proud of, and something that has a real, genuine purpose, not just to entertain, but actually delivers real value on so many levels. And yeah, I think it's one of the greatest things you've ever done, mate. I love it.
No, I agree. And the other thing about it is I love having all the other voices in it. The fact that there's differing opinions on the same subject, I think that's so important for writers to see. So
yeah. Hey, Jeff, before we close out on that very positive note, what are your big hopes for 2021? How are you feeling about the year we're in the middle of?
It's still nerve-wracking. I mean, we're still in a period of great uncertainty. We have to be extremely careful still. It's the point where I feel like, as in many things, you let down your guard too soon, and things happen that you can't anticipate. So I'm being very cautious. I am trying to immerse myself in my work as much as possible. At the same time, I'm also trying to be of use in local politics and other things environmentally. But this is definitely a transition year, and people need to forgive themselves if they can't, fire on all cylinders. It's just simply still one of those years, and hopefully 2022 will be better. So
I think that's very well said. What I particularly respond to that you just said is that people need to be able to forgive themselves, and I think that's the key. You can't hold yourself to this really high account of what can be done. And right now, as we're recording this, we're looking at parts of the world that have been very poorly served by the pandemic. And just because there are muscular vaccination programs in the US and in the UK, there are parts of the developed and the not developed world that are really tremendously suffering at the moment, and we're all in one ecosystem together, right? Which is
it's a test run for the climate crisis, and is part of the climate crisis in a way. But it's definitely important that we start dealing with these things in a global response way, because otherwise it comes back on us anyway, as well. In addition to the humanitarian and the real reasons you should do it, but it's also, everything's tied together. So
true. You cannot sit in an ivory tower and deal with it in isolation. That's just not possible.
No.
Yeah. Now, I think on that note, this has been Forbidden Planet TV. I've been talking to the amazing Jeff VanderMeer about his work, about his ecological focus, and about his process, about new weird fiction. Thank you so much for joining me, mate. It's been a real pleasure.
Yeah, thanks. That was fun. I appreciate it.
Yeah, no, it's awesome. And you can buy his latest novel, Hummingbird Salamander, and a bunch of other stuff of his from the links attached to this interview. Take care, Jeff. We'll see you soon.
All right. Take care.
Bye-bye. If you're enjoying watching Forbidden Planet TV, and you're enjoying watching us talk to the world's most interesting and accomplished filmmakers, authors, artists, musicians, creators, subscribe right here. See you soon.